Well, hello everybody. How's it going? Welcome to D4. This is the show where we typically do deep dives into character builds, and similar to last week, today I needed to release another video that breaks down the ranking of my Nova damage builds as opposed to the sustained DPR builds that I did last week. The spreadsheet that I keep on my Nova damage builds has also become overly crowded again, and just for ease of use and user friendliness, make some additional tiers. Similar to the video that I did on ranking my sustained DPR builds, this is totally unscripted, and I'm going to do very light editing, otherwise I'm just never going to get it released. So, if you are a relatively new viewer to the channel, this might be a fun way for you to kind of see all of the Nova builds and burst damage builds that I've done over the last couple of years, and just kind of get an idea for what they are, and maybe see if there's one that sounds really interesting to you, as I'll give kind of a brief synopsis of each of them as I talk about them. And for longtime viewers, again, hopefully this is just a fun trip down memory lane for you. But if nothing else, it might serve as a good kind of catalog if you're going to be doing a one-shot soon, or playing a longer campaign even, and you think, I want to build a character that's really good at burst damage. Well, here's like dozens of options for you to consider. Yeah, it's going to be rambly. There's going to be ums and pauses, and feel free to turn it on to 1.5 speed or 2 times speed, or even faster. Maybe there's somebody out there who does 2.5. That's insane. But yeah, let's just jump right in. So as a reminder, I would say the majority of the builds that I've done for this channel do tend to be sustained damage builds, right? Ones that you can do reliable high damage for at least one entire combat encounter, ideally more. But then I've also done a lot of builds where the goal of the character is to do as much damage as possible in one single glorious round of combat, right? Always with the expenditure of very valuable resources. And the goal of these characters is typically to take an enemy, or 2 or 3 sometimes, out of combat very early on, and thus turn the tide of the combat in your party's favor right from the get-go. Usually these builds don't do as much sort of sustained reliable damage round after round after round, but arguably it's even more valuable to be able to remove an enemy or 2 from the battlefield early on. And then, so what if you're not doing as much damage later? The numbers are in your party's favor now, and you can just sort of coast through the rest of combat, or at the very least, combat is much easier than it otherwise would be, right? Action economy, all of those things. So yeah, I think there's a lot of value in burst damage characters. To review how we come up with the tier scores and determine who's in tier 3, who's in tier 2, who's in tier 1, etc. It's very simple, where we just take the damage at every armor class that we calculate for, or saving throws as the case may be, at every damage report that we report on, level 6, 9, 13, and 17, and then just average all of those and come up with one number. Yeah, maybe we should give more weight to the earlier levels, sure. Maybe we should find a way to give more weight to those who can do a thing more often, or might be resisted less frequently, etc., etc. I'm not going to worry about any of that. We're just doing this in a lab, and it's really up to each of you to watch the video if you're interested, determine how well you think this might actually work in game, if you think the numbers are inflated or deflated, etc. Mostly I just want to do something that's simple, quick, easy, so that I can have a clean way to separate my builds in the spreadsheets, right? Keep it simple. Starting us off then at what I'm calling tier 4, I might change to just the area of effect or multi-target tier, based on some feedback that I got on last week's video. We've got, characters who are doing damage to more than one enemy, but in burst form. I appreciate that very often it's more valuable to do as much damage as possible to a single target, thereby increasing the chance that you'll just completely remove them from the fight, as opposed to doing some damage to a lot of targets, because that might leave all of your enemies at, half health, as opposed to one enemy dead. And in that case, it's usually better off to have one enemy dead than several at half health, because they're still going to be able to take their turns and potentially do damage to your party or heal one another, etc., right? That said, there's definitely a time and a place for multi-target damage. Whittling people down and getting them low might set them up for your other party members to then be able to take them out where they wouldn't have otherwise been able to had they not been low in the first place, right? Or sometimes you might have hordes of fairly weak enemies and a well-placed fireball could just eliminate multiple bad guys in one fell swoop, right? So I think bringing somebody with multi-target damage capabilities is a great idea for every single D&D party. Now, to date, I've only done 3 area of effect multi-target damage burst nova builds, right? And I'm sure I'll add more as time goes on. So for now, it's a very small tier. It's a short list. So anyway, starting us off in the multi-target tier, coming in at last place with a tier score of 107, we have the Dragon Monk. Man, when the Ascendant Dragon Monk subclass was announced as part of Fizzbands, I was so excited because, as many of you know, monks are like my favorite class, thematically at the very least. And I love dragons, and so it was like, oh my gosh, a combination of like 2 of my favorite things about D&D. And they were just a little underwhelming. But I did have a lot of fun creating this build, and basically it was like we took a Dragonborn for our racial and then combined like the breath weapon attack that they get with the area of effect attack that Ascendant Dragon Monks get to do sort of lots of cone elemental lightning based damage, right? And it worked fairly well. The amount of damage that I was assuming they were doing was pretty good if we would have been looking at single target, right? Spread out amongst 2 or 3 enemies, it was just kind of okay. But still, really cool, really fun, flavorful, thematic. Towards the end of the build, we even took some cleric levels in order to get Tempest Cleric stuff and do max damage on the lightning area of effect that we were doing. So yeah, anyway, it was a lot of fun. I still would be really curious to try them out in game. I think it would be interesting and potentially cool. I'd probably want to try it in a one-shot before I committed to it full-time for a campaign. But especially, in those fights where there were sort of lots of enemies, especially lots of weaker enemies, it would feel pretty cool and powerful. Next up is the first multi-target or area of effect burst damage build that I ever did. With a tier score of 207, it is the Evoker Wizard, the Evocation Blaster Wizard. This was the first area of effect blast or Nova build that I ever did. And it was a lot of fun. It was pretty straightforward. Mostly Evocation Wizard, couple of fighter levels for Action Surge, and we were just like fireballing, or incendiary clouding, or chain lightninging, whatever the situation called for, depending on the level that we were. But yeah, it was just kind of your old school, straight up blaster that just did tons of damage in big areas to lots of bad guys. It was a lot of fun. And then finally, leading the way with our multi-target burst or nova damage builds at a 210 tier score, we have a build that I did fairly recently, the Burst of Light, the Light Cleric. And I loved this character. They were sort of all about throwing out fireballs, being the only cleric that gets access to the fireball spell, but then also using Spirit Guardian. So you've kind of got 2 of the best area of effect damage spells in the game, in my opinion. Very quintessential, right? You're blasting people with a fireball, and then you've got Spirit Guardians going, and you're basically pulling people into the area of effect of Spirit Guardians via the telekinesis feat, things like that. So yeah, that one was a lot of fun, and it's actually one that I kind of took parts of to make my character that I'm playing in our Tales of Veneria campaign right now, Aloma Stargazer, who's part Light Cleric, part Stars Druid, and one little bitty part Genie Warlock too. That brings us to tier 3 then, and from this point on, all of the builds that we're talking about are going to be single target Nova or burst damage builds. And coming in last place at tier 3 is the very recent Poison Dart Frog with a tier score of 67. This was a really fun attempt to try to build around the blowgun and the poisoner feat. something that I'd been doing for a long time, that I'd been wanting to do for a long time, that a lot of you had requested that I do for a long time. The reality is there's nothing super redeeming about the blowgun in and of itself. The build would have done a little bit better damage using a different weapon, but it wouldn't have been that much different, as I kind of really tried to point out in the video, right? In D&D, it's really not so much about the weapon damage as it is about the weapon properties and the things you can do then with the right weapon. So if it's a ranged weapon, you can do sharpshooter. If you're adding poisoner feat, you don't have to take the crossbow expert feat. Then we can build something that does pretty respectable burst damage. They were a froggy, right? They were a grung, right? And we just kind of did our best to get as much mileage as we possibly could out of probably the weakest weapon in D&D 5e. I had a good time with it. Next up, coming in with a tier score of 70, we have the Whippoorwill. This was a similar attempt to build around a weapon that's often thought of as kind of weaker, right? But in this case, it was the whip. And we went mostly rogue. We had some paladin levels. We were in Aarakocra, so we were kind of flying. And this was actually the one that I did in conjunction with my friend Randall Hampton. I went over the build and he sort of drew it live as I was describing it. It was really cool and fun. It ended up being a long video for that reason, because we kind of would get off on tangents sometimes or have to pause a little bit as he was drawing. The nice thing about the Whippoorwill is that even though their burst damage wasn't super high, they could actually do that level of damage more frequently than a lot of the burst damage builds that I do. So yeah, 70 on average, right? But you could probably do it that level of damage 2 or 3 rounds per rest, as opposed to maybe just once per day in a lot of these cases. So yeah, we were kind of flying above our enemies so that we could get some distance on them, whipping them, applying sneak attack, applying smite. And yeah, it was cool and fun and powerful. Up next, we have the Thunderball, the secret agent. Most of these that I'm talking about here are fairly recent. The Thunderball had a tier score of 75, and they were an infiltrator mixed with a little fighter for action surge, some cleric for tempest cleric, because all the damage that you're doing as an infiltrator out of your special weapon anyway, right, is lightning based, so I wanted to get some max damage out of the cleric's Tempest Cleric's Channel Divinity. And then we even finished off with rogue levels there for sneak attack, and because it felt thematically appropriate, as we were sort of this spy-like secret agent, right? Really cool. I love making use of the Armor Artificer. I had only done one other build using the Infiltrator model for the Armor Artificer, so I always have a good time trying to come up with ways to make that fun and different and unique, and that was one of them. Next up is the Shadow Sorcerer with a 96 tier score. That's a big jump from the previous one. Shadow Sorcerer was awesome, and still I think my favorite thumbnail to date. Thanks to my friend Preston for doctoring that up. Yeah, the Shadow Sorcerer was awesome. They're, again, focused on blasting spells, but also making use of their Hound of Ill Omen, right? Which kind of has some limited use, but is pretty good against a single target, especially when you can couple it with some other really effective burst damage attacks. We were often putting Bane on the target to lower their saving throws, and then hitting them with just the best burst damage spell we could, along with attacks from our Hound. So that might have been Lightning Bolt or Disintegrate, all kind of depending on the level, right? Yeah, I'm gonna play that one day, just so I can be my best emo self. Up next, with a tier score of 100, we have the Swashy Nova, the Swashbuckler Nova. So this was a swashbuckler rogue who was really trying to take advantage, as I've done for a few builds now, of the fact that sneak attack damage can happen once on a turn, not just once on your turn. So trying to do things to guarantee that they would get an attack as their reaction, in addition to the attacks that they were making on their turn, and thus getting sneak attack twice in a round, right? We went Battle Master there, and Swashbuckler is great because you can attack, move away without taking an opportunity attack, and then if the enemy moves up to attack you, you can hit him with a repost from the Battle Master, or brace attack. Whatever the Battle Master maneuver is that lets you make an attack as somebody approaches you. Now I have to look it up. Right, brace. Anyway, Cool, simple, straightforward, fun, tons of damage. And also letting you be a rogue, and a really good one at that. Up next, with a tier score of 102, we have the Whisperer, the Whispers Bard. And this one was a conglomeration of lots of things. We took some Hexblade levels, mostly to get Charisma as our attack stat, right? So we wouldn't be quite so mad. Lots of Bard levels so that we could get that Psychic Whispers feature that lets you add some damage to your attacks, almost like a smite, but you use Bardic Inspiration, do some extra psychic damage. We actually took Fighter for Action Surge, of course, and then some Cleric, some Grave Cleric to get Path to the Grave, so that we could use Path to the Grave, Action Surge, and make one big, massive attack then with a Rapier, piling on Hexblade's Curse and your Psychic Whispers and all of those kind of juicy things that let you do more damage. Just basically doubling everything we were doing thanks to Path to the Grave. Really cool Bard build. And then finally, at the top of the charts for Tier 3, we have the Barbarian. This was my attempt to answer the call that so many of you had given me to make a Barbarian, a Bard mixed with a Barbarian. They were strength-based, they were dual-wielding axes, they looked like Slash. This was one of my favorite artworks that Randall's done for any of my build concepts. They were a Zealot Barbarian and a Swords Bard to get a little extra damage with flourishes, and with the Zealous Barbarians extra 1d6 that they get. Can't remember what that feature is called off the top of my head. We ended up taking some Paladin levels so that we could be smiting as well, dual-wielding axes. Yeah, it was just kind of a, raging barbarian that liked to sing. And it was unique and very flavorful and fun. And I'm just going to say fun for every single one of these builds. So hopefully you won't hold that against me, because I really do think that they will be fun to play. I definitely had fun creating every single one of them. So there. All right, Tier 2. So starting us off at the bottom of Tier 2 with a tier score of 115, we have the Storm Tempest, the Storm Sorcerer Tempest Cleric. This was, again, another one of those builds where it's like, everybody always asks to do a Storm Sorcerer Tempest Cleric, even though I think that the Storm Sorcerer is kind of underpowered, and you'd be better off going another route, numbers-wise anyway. But again, it's like, well, I don't care so much about the numbers. I want to play a Storm Sorcerer Tempest Cleric. That's cool for me thematically. It's the character that I want to do. So how strong can we make that combination, right? And yeah, that was a good one. We were mostly using Chromatic Orb, if I remember right, doing lightning damage, obviously, and then all of the other kind of tricks and flavorful things that you can do as either a Storm Sorcerer or Tempest Cleric, using their Channel Divinity to get the maximum amount of damage that we could from that Chromatic Orb. We were eventually using Booming Blade on that build as well, because it does thunder damage, right? And pushing them with Booming Blade and then hitting them with a big spell, and then getting a little extra damage from our Storm Sorcerer feature, all kinds of stuff. It was fun. It was it was really fun. It was not just your kind of straight up like, I'm going to cast some lightning spells at you, but we were making weapon attacks, we were moving them, pushing them, hitting them, doing lots of little kind of lightning and thunder damage sort of throughout our turn. I don't know. It was cool. I had a good time with that. Next up, at a tier score of 118, was the Arcane Spellbow. This was my attempt to build a character sort of around the Arcane Archer fighter subclass, with the understanding that we were not going to have as many levels of fighter for this build as we would of other things, namely a Warlock. The problem with Arcane Archer, as I get into in the video, is that they just don't scale all that well. They're arcane shots or whatever. You get the best one early on, and then you just don't get a lot of other benefit out of like taking more levels in Arcane Archer, other than the things that you get from being a fighter, right? Level 11, you get a third attack, etc. So we went Dow Genie Warlock, so that we could push our target when we hit them with our arcane shot, and did I think it's the grasping arrow that does damage to them initially and then does damage to them if they move, and so pushing them was causing additional damage. So we were kind of trying to get creative about taking advantage of and building around that one really cool arcane shot that they get and finding ways to increase the damage. And I think the best way to do that was via Warlock. It made for an interesting and kind of different type of fighter, I suppose. So yeah, it was fun. Up next, with a tier score of 120, we have the Mercy Monk. And I think probably the next time I play a monk in a longer campaign, it will be based around this character. Mercy Monk is, I think, the strongest monk subclass currently in the game. I played him in a one-shot, loved it. A lot of it was due to things like key empowered strikes, where you could try a stunning strike on an enemy and then get an additional attack as a bonus action from them. But Mercy Monks are just cool because, you know, you can do a little bit extra damage, you can do a little bit of healing when you're using your flurry of blows, and it just felt pretty powerful. Now with this character, we did take some fighter levels for Action Surge, and we even took some Warlock levels, Hexblade even. Just to try and take advantage of Hexblade's Curse and Hex. I think in the end, you know, if I played them in game, I probably would skip those Warlock levels and just see if I couldn't get the most out of Monk, maybe mixed with Fighter as possible. It would lower the burst damage a smidge, but it would get me into my key points faster and the other cool, you know, Monk features that come later. So anyway, it was a good one. They did decent damage if they could get everything going, right? Hex and Hexblade's Curse was super bonus action heavy. But if you could make that happen and then just let loose with Flurry of Blows, Action Surging, and applying your Mercy Monk extra damage and poisoning your enemies and all those kinds of things, it could be pretty devastating in a single round if you could afford the setup to get there. So anyway, good times. Up next, with a tier score of 126, we have the Death Knight. This build actually kind of went crazy. At the time, it was like setting records for me for views and like fastest to whatever landmark, you know, when it first came out. And I think it might have been the name. I think a lot of people were probably coming looking for something that was either affiliated with World of Warcraft or Dragonlance. And maybe we're disappointed to find that it was neither of those things. This was just an attempt to take advantage of the Death Cleric's Channel Divinity, my first ever attempt to do that. And so we went Rune Knight Fighter, we put Paladin levels in there, and then, yeah, kind of like, was it the Whisperer? You know, you'd use the Death Cleric's Path to the Grave, Action Surge, and then make a big, huge attack using Divine Smite, right? And just trying to pile on as much damage as you could in that initial double damage hit, and then, you know, do whatever else you could afterwards. It was pretty devastating, lots of damage, and had some decent like versatility and variety to it too by the end of the day, with a little bit of Cleric, a little bit of Paladin. You had some support features in there along with your burst damage, so that was cool. Anyway, that was a good one. Up next, we have my first ever Bladesinger Nova build, the Bladesinger Nova. I am so creative with my names. Yeah, this was good times. This was like mostly Bladesinger, but taking some fighter levels. Excuse me. Not only for Action Surge, but to go Battle Master and get Quick Toss, because Shadow Blade, as everybody knows, can be thrown as a bonus action. And so it was lots of Shadow Blade attacks, and then bonus action throw the Shadow Blade as well, with Quick Toss, you know, adding all of the superiority die damage that you're getting from Battle Master, and then just all the goodies that Bladesingers get, and all of the extra fun, juicy damage that you get from Shadow Blade. So yeah, I loved that one. And I think it would make a really strong Bladesinger build outside of your Nova round, even. Potente. And then coming up next with a tier score of 142, we have the Catch-22. Man, I loved this build. I had as much fun building this character as just about any other character that I've ever done. It was just all about like putting a character or an enemy in a lose-lose situation, right? I played this character in the one shot that I did with the Dungeon Dudes and Treant Monk in the 30,000 subscriber celebration last January, and I'm like gonna hit 60,000 subscribers here in a minute, if I haven't already, I guess, by the time this gets released, and that's crazy. Anyway, yeah, it was like paladin sorcerer primarily, and you would do Cloud of Daggers behind somebody and then go golfing, right, and hit them with a maul, crush your feet, push them into the Cloud of Daggers, smiting at the same time, and then they're kind of sitting there going on their next turn, okay, do I stay here in the Cloud of Daggers or do I move, because we put Booming Blade on them when we hit them, and if I move I take damage, but if I stay I take damage, and I don't know, it was cool and fun and unique and very flavorful, and so it was a lot of fun to play in game. Even though it didn't work as well as I wanted it to in that one shot with the Dungeon Dudes, especially in that first round, because we were up against Storm Giants and they were immune to all the thunder damage I was trying to do, so that made me mad. Anyway, good times. And thanks again to Rob Vera for giving me the idea for that build. It was kind of based on something that he had sent me. Coming in at also 142 tier score, but just fractionally more, the Needler. Ooh, I loved this character. This was I think my first attempt to build around a subpar weapon. And it kind of opened my eyes a little bit to what is possible with, even undervalued, first glance underpowered weapons like the dart. Because it has both the thrown property and is considered a ranged weapon, there were just things you could do with it that you can't do with other weapons, right? And so we built like a Gloomstalker Battlemaster with a little Assassin Rogue in there later, I think. And they were just quick tossing a net to, restrain an enemy and then just letting loose with as many dart attacks as they possibly could, and did a ton of damage. For a long time, they were actually like my biggest damage dealer of my burst damage builds, especially at early levels. And in fact, they're probably still to date. If I look, they're second only to one other build at that first damage report, the level 6 damage report. So especially if you're playing like an early level campaign and you're looking for a strong burst damage build, you can't go wrong with the Needler. And then finally, at the top of tier 2, with a tier score of 152, a character that is very near and dear to my heart because they are the character that I played for over a year in our Tales of Veneria campaign, Ceradon. I based her off of this character, the Lockadin Bard. It was pretty, standard. I don't know if standard is the right word, but kind of a crit fishing build. I was a Hexblade Warlock with Paladin levels, and then Whispers Bard. And basically you're just putting Hexblade's Curse on, going the whole Darkness Devil Sight route, or later, Shadow of Moil, Greater Invisibility, so that you can get yourself advantage, and just going in and, critting on a 19, thanks to Hexblade's Curse, having advantage, Elven Accuracy, triple advantage, and just smiting to the moon. And yeah, for those of you who watch Tales of Veneria, you probably saw me with this character coming in and just one-shotting bosses some of the time, and much to my DM Corey's dismay. And in fact, after the episode that we recorded last week for Tales of Veneria, this is kind of a little behind the scenes. It was our second session, I think, of season 2, and I'm playing a different character. Sardon is ridden off into the sunset, and I'm playing Aloma, as I've mentioned, I think. And we had a really, really hard fight, and we almost TPK'd. And after we stopped recording, Corey kind of looked at us and said, I am going to need to learn to rebalance my combat encounters now that Ceradon's no longer in the party. Which I thought was funny. So I guess Aloma has, some proving himself to do here to live up to the legacy. But yeah, Lockadin Bard, tons of big melee halberd glaive burst damage with smites. A blast to play. And that brings us to Tier 1. So, starting off at the bottom of Tier 1 currently with a tier score of 143 is the Swords Bard. This was the first and maybe only still to date character that I've done that's primarily a Swords Bard. I dipped into it plenty of times otherwise, but yeah, this was like, I want to do mostly a Swords Bard. And hooray, they ended up being stronger than some of those other builds where I was just dipping Swords Bard, so that was cool. Obviously, you get all of the utility and fun and kind of support features that bards are naturally going to bring with them. But then we took some fighter levels for Action Surge, not until later. We took Paladin levels, I think only up to Oath of Vengeance, if I remember, so we could use Vow of Enmity. And yeah, we were just putting like either Fairy Fire or maybe even Hunter's Mark on our targets and just making as many attacks as we could. We were dual wielding and then just using those flourishes to great effect, doing tons of damage. It was kind of a slicey dicey character and frankly pretty perfect for what you would think about when you think about a Swords Bard, I think. Had a really good time with that one. Coming in at a 144 tier score, we have the Gloomstalker Ranger. So yeah, this was again my I think the only character that I've done to date that doesn't just dip Gloomstalker, but that is like mostly a Gloomstalker. We were totally abusing the new Bugbear from Monsters of the Multiverse, where they get extra damage, right, on their attacks for that first round. We ended up getting some rogue levels for sneak attack, fighter levels obviously for Action Surge, and then yeah, just unloading with a rifle, actually with a boomstick, a blunderbuss, what's the word? A musket. That was, I think, my first musket build. Yeah, you were just putting out so much damage right at the beginning, like any burst damage should do, right? And it was pretty devastating. Up next, with a pretty significant leap up to 171 tier score, we have the Vengeance Pally, the Oath of Vengeance Pally. Again, something that I dipped into before, but never done like a mostly Vengeance Paladin build. And yeah, this was pretty devastating as well. Really powerful. If I were to play a Paladin in game next, again, I think I'd probably go this route. You know, being able to just get advantage on one enemy once per short rest, like Oath of Vengeance Paladins do, without having to cast any spells or anything like that, it's just guaranteed for an entire minute, can really be devastating if you're also smiting with Action Surge. And I think we ended up going, if I'm not mistaken, Echo Knight here for even more attacks and just being a smite storm of damage. I even did an alternate version of the build in the final thoughts there, if I recall, that was built around the double-bladed scimitar. And it was a dex-based paladin, and I get a lot of you requesting a dex-based paladin and or a double-bladed scimitar build, so if you're interested, go to the Oath of Vengeance video and just skip to the final thoughts and kind of see how I broke it down there. Maybe I'll do a full video on it or something like it in the future, but yeah, that was a good one. Had a lot of fun with it. Up next, with a tier score of 173, we have the Will Wheaton, the Nuclear Wizard. Now, this is not a build that I can really take a lot of credit for, right? It's kind of been known out there for quite some time, and in fact, I think Ludic Savant is maybe the one who at least coined the phrase Nuclear Wizard, if not originated the build completely himself. And for those who don't know, in all of my video descriptions, I post a link to Ludic Savant's damage calculator, and it's what I use when I'm calculating damage, so you can scroll down and find that. He's a great guy. But yeah, the Nuclear Wizard, this was an attempt to basically foolproof my damage. Built for Will Wheaton, who is famously terrible at dice rolling. It was like lots of magic missile damage, basically, where you're putting Hexblade's Curse on somebody, and then as an evocation wizard later on, you're getting to add damage to your evocation spells, and yeah, it's sort of foolproof, just blasting them with lots of magic missiles. I did kind of try and tweak it a little bit and make it my own, in that we were also using Cloud of Daggers. We were telekinetically shoving them into Cloud of Daggers to take damage and hitting them with magic missile. Then they were moving up, and we were, basically like pushing them back into Cloud of Daggers, hitting them with Magic Missile, action surging, hitting them with Magic Missile again. So the thing that makes the damage so good when you look at it as an aggregate, as an average, was that Magic Missile, of course, does damage to an enemy regardless of their armor class. And so does Cloud of Daggers, for that matter, though they did have a chance to save against our telekinetic shove. And so it was really only their saving throw that was lowering the damage as things went up. But, if you compared them at lower ACs to some of these other tier 1 builds, their damage isn't quite as good most of the time. But at higher ACs, it's like way, way better. So, something to keep in mind when you're thinking about this build. Again, it just does solid damage regardless of the enemy armor class, regardless of what you're rolling. And so, yeah, that's why I kind of wanted it for Will Wheaton. I certainly hope that he sees it one day and even tries it out in game. Up next, with a tier score of 179, we have the Flamethrower. This was, I think, the first single target burst damage build I ever did that was spell focused. I hope I'm not wrong there. But anyway, it's very potent and it works really well. I've seen it in game even, and it was basically, taking advantage of the fact that Scorching Ray does multiple attacks, multiple hits when you cast it. And so we were trying to find ways to add damage to each hit, similar to what we do for most weapon damage builds. But, so throwing up Hexblade's Curse or the Hex spell, and then just unloading with as many Scorching Rays as we possibly could. Fighter for action surge, of course. I think we ended up ultimately going Tempest Cleric there too, though that was more for flavor and fun than anything. You'd get a little extra damage out of their Channel Divinity by, transmuting your fire spell into lightning, but not a ton. Yeah, that was a good one, and I've been really impressed with how well it's worked when I've seen it. Muy poderoso. If you want to be a blaster sorcerer, single target focused, take a look at the Flamethrower. Up next, with a 189 tier score, we have the Assassiner. This was old. This was like episode 5, I think. And it was my first ever Nova damage build. And at the time, I didn't really think I was going to do many more of them. I was wrong. It was good. It was fun. It was a monster of a build. It was like you took sorcerer levels, rogue levels, paladin levels. And in my naivete, I completely forgot to add fighter levels for Action Surge. Had I done so, this score would be a lot higher, and I bet it would probably be higher than anything that I've done to date. But it did have a big, huge asterisk on it in that this level of damage was only doable if we had Surprise. I think it's the only build to date that I've done that was like making that assumption, and I don't like it. But if you wanted to play an Assassin Rogue and you felt really confident that you were going to be able to get Surprise reliably, this one would be really good to look at. You were casting Shadow Blade, you were smiting, you were getting sneak attack damage, and it was all kinds of craziness. But anyway, yeah, and critting on every attack, theoretically, right? So that's why it did so well. So if you can get Surprise and you want to play an Assassin, check out the Assassiner. Up next, breaking the bicentennial barrier with a tier score of 215 is the Shepherd Druid. You see that look on my face? Yeah, you know why. It's because they're using the Conjure Animal spell and just trying to abuse it as much as they can. And as most of my longtime viewers know, I'm not a big fan of the spell. I think it's too easy and overpowered and tends to bog and clog down games. Even though Treant Monk did use it very effectively and efficiently in that one shot, that 30,000 subscriber one shot that we did. Yeah, this one was super straightforward. We went Kobold, the new mom Kobold, so that we could take advantage of that Draconic Cry, and thereby, for one round at least, give all of our conjured animals advantage on their attacks. And that is what really kind of put it over the edge, I think, and why I built it as a burst damage build, because Draconic Cry is only usable proficiency bonus times per day, right? So you're running up, you're letting out your little baby dragon cry, and then all of your conjured animals are just swooping in and doing boatloads of damage. And yeah, we were conjuring Deep Rothe. Our character was just hiding. They weren't even doing anything. They were just concentrating on the spell. I mean, you could like try and cast cantrips on your turn or whatever. But yeah, they were just like sitting there and not really doing anything, and being one of the best support characters in the game as a Shepherd Druid, thanks to all the access they get to those spells and the Shepherd Druid features, and then just also doing about as much damage as any character in the game. So, conjure animals. But speaking of big, huge asterisks, coming in at number 1 for tier 1, so leading the pack for Nova damage, single target, burst builds, we have my namesake, the Critlander. Yeah, I still laugh at how many comments I get from people that say things in my videos like, I didn't know Homelander played D&D. And yeah, I mean, I get it. Sure, I'll own it. I guess I look like the guy. And so this, and by the way, I think the first short that I ever did on this channel was kind of making fun of that, but also making fun of how many people say things like, you should do ASMR, which I appreciate and love. Thank you. I'm grateful that you think I have a nice voice and that you often fall asleep to it. That's a little weird. Anyway, yeah, that's a funny short if you haven't seen it. I thought anyway. I even put on a bathrobe. Yeah, the Critlander was basically my attempt to get critical hits all the time. Like the Assassin, this time, like, I know I can assume that we're going to be getting a crit because we're using the Hold Person spell, and thus paralyzing our enemies, and thus, when we're making melee attacks against them, guaranteed crits. So it was the Critlander. Now, the big huge asterisk, of course, is that we were using Hold Person to paralyze our enemies, and that only works against humanoids. So this level of damage is really only doable against humanoids, and as we all know, not every enemy that you fight in D&D 5e is going to be a humanoid. So grain of salt, right? 228 tier score. Don't think I mentioned that yet. Anyway, we were a Sorkadin with some fighter levels for Action Surge, and yeah, we were just going in. I think it was a Divine Soul Sorcerer and an Oath of Devotion Paladin, if I'm not mistaken. But the subclasses were not super important here. It was basically, cast Hold Person with a bonus action, Quicken Spell, right? And then just going in and whacking them with your greatsword and smiting on every single hit, action surging and doing it all again, and just piling on so much damage with those guaranteed criticals and smite doubling in damage. Yeah, it was ridiculous if you could be fighting humanoids. Obviously, we could have gone the route of taking more sorcerer levels faster to get to Hold Monster, and then it would have worked more reliably, but it would have slowed down our progression otherwise. So I ended up not going that route, though it definitely would have been, something worth considering doing. Anyway, it was awesome. It was fun. The screenshot or the thumbnail that is, was fantastic. My friend Preston doctored it up to make me look even more Homelander-ish. And yeah, so that's kind of the end of the rankings for the Nova builds. If you look at them, I guess I would say what I said on the last time I ranked the Nova builds, I guess, which is that the Flamethrower might be the one that works best, just kind of without big asterisks, right? The Assassin, you needed surprise. The Critlander only works against humanoids, and the Shepherd Druid sucks because it uses conjure animals. Fine. The Shepherd Druid is the actual king of Nova damage builds without any major asterisks attached, and without you actually needing to do anything as your player character other than cast the spell and let out a little draconic squeak. So I'm not bitter, you're bitter. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this little trip down memory lane. I had a lot of fun with it. These are great characters. They all have a place that's near and dear to my heart. And hopefully have one for some of you as well. I hope you got a good idea for maybe the next character that you might want to try out in your next campaign or one-shot. But that's it for now. So until next time, I love you guys. You're awesome. Thank you for all that you do for the channel. Have a fantastic day. Be good and kind, and we'll see you soon.